In the vast deserts of southern Iraq, 100 miles south of Baghdad, a great archaeological mound rises 60 feet into the burning sky, stretching almost a mile across the ancient plain. This is Nippur, the mooring rope of heaven and earth, a city so sacred that for more than 3,000 years, no king could claim legitimate rule over Mesopotamia without recognition from its temples. Here, beneath layers of windswept sand and crumbling brick, lie more than 30,000 clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped cuneiform script, each one a fragment of humanity's oldest written stories. The tablets speak of three gods whose names once echoed across every temple and palace from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. Anu, the distant father of heaven. Enlil, the storm lord who commanded wind and fate. Enki, the wise trickster who dwelled in the sweet waters beneath the earth. Together, these three divine beings formed what scholars call the Divine Triad, the supreme council that ruled the cosmos, created humanity, and shaped every aspect of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. But here's what makes this story remarkable. These weren't just mythological characters invented to explain thunder or rainfall. These three gods represented something far more sophisticated, a complete philosophical system about power, wisdom, and the relationship between divine authority and earthly governance. Their stories, preserved on clay for 4 millennia, reveal a civilization grappling with questions we still ask today. Who holds ultimate authority? How should power be distributed? What responsibilities do the powerful owe to those beneath them? And when the gods themselves disagree, who decides the fate of humanity? The answer lies buried in those 30,000 tablets, waiting to tell us how three gods shaped not just the ancient world, but the very foundations of how we think about civilization itself. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how these ancient stories connect people across continents and cultures. And if you're fascinated by the real history of human civilization, not wild theories or alien speculation, but the actual archaeological evidence of how our ancestors thought and built and dreamed, then hit that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to show you is more extraordinary than any fiction. This is the story of the Divine Triad. Three gods who weren't just worshipped. They were the blueprint for every government, every legal system, every social hierarchy in the ancient Near East. Their conflicts became humanity's origin story. Their decisions shaped the flood myths that would echo through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And their temples became the world's first bureaucracies, managing economies that rivaled modern corporations. We're going to explore how these three deities emerged from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia to become the most powerful concept in the ancient world. We'll see how priests used their authority to control kings, how their myths justified social hierarchies, and how their stories reveal a sophistication that shatters every stereotype about primitive ancient peoples. This is real history, verified by archaeology, translated from original sources, and it's more fascinating than anything Hollywood could invent. So let's begin 5,000 years ago in the land between two rivers where humanity first learned to write, to build cities, and to ask the biggest questions of all. To understand the Divine Triad, you must first understand the world that created them. Picture southern Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BCE, the Ubaid and early Uruk periods, when the first true cities began to emerge from scattered agricultural villages. This isn't the Mesopotamia of popular imagination, all golden temples and hanging gardens. This is a harsh, unforgiving landscape where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flood unpredictably, where summer temperatures reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where survival depends on massive irrigation projects and coordinated labor on a scale never before attempted by humans. The southern alluvial plain, stretching from modern Baghdad to the Persian Gulf, presents a paradox that would shape Mesopotamian religion forever. The soil, deposited by millennia of river flooding, is incredibly fertile, capable of producing grain yields that wouldn't be matched until modern industrial agriculture. But this same fertility depends on floods that arrive at the wrong time for planting, that destroy as often as they nourish, that must be controlled through backbreaking work, or they'll turn the land into malarial swamp. Water is everywhere and nowhere. Too much during spring floods, too little during the scorching summers. The rivers meander and change course, abandoning cities that depended on them. Soil salinity creeps upward as irrigation water evaporates, poisoning the earth that feeds you. And there are no mountains to quarry stone, no forests to provide lumber, no metal deposits to forge tools. Everything must be imported from distant lands, traded for the one resource you have in abundance, grain. This is the environment that produces the world's first civilization, and it produces a religious system that reflects its reality. The gods, like the rivers, are powerful but unpredictable. They demand constant labor, massive construction projects, elaborate rituals. They can be generous or destructive, sometimes both at once, and they organize themselves into a hierarchy as complex as the irrigation systems that keep the cities alive. The earliest settlements, places like Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was the first city ever created, begin as clusters of mud brick houses around a simple shrine. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed 18 successive temple levels, each built directly atop its predecessor, spanning from 5400 BCE to 600 BCE. The earliest temples are modest affairs, perhaps 20 feet square, but already they follow a specific orientation. Already they contain offering tables and a platform for a divine image. By 4000 BCE, these settlements have grown into something unprecedented in human history. Uruk, the city that gives its name to an entire period, sprawls across 1,200 acres with a population approaching 50,000 people. Its walls, 5 miles in circumference, enclose not just homes but massive temple complexes. The Eanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, covers over 220,000 square feet. The White Temple stands atop a 40-foot ziggurat visible for miles across the flat plains, a mountain built by human hands in a land without mountains. These cities require administration on a scale that necessitates writing. Around 3400 BCE in Uruk, someone makes marks on clay, not pictures, but abstract symbols representing sounds and concepts. Cuneiform is born from economic necessity, invented to track grain allocations, labor assignments, and temple revenues. But once you can write, you can record more than accounts. You can record laws, king lists, and eventually the stories of the gods themselves. And what those stories reveal is a cosmos organized with startling precision. The universe is divided into 3 realms, each ruled by one of the great gods. Heaven belongs to Anu, whose name simply means sky in Sumerian. Earth, specifically the atmosphere, the space between heaven and ground where weather happens, belongs to Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind. The Abzu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water that feeds the springs and rivers, belongs to Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth. This isn't arbitrary mythology. This is a sophisticated cosmological model that explains observable reality. Why does rain fall from the sky? Because Enlil, Lord of the atmosphere, releases it. Why do springs bubble up from the ground? Because Enki controls the waters beneath. Why does the sun travel across the heavens? Because it moves through Anu's domain. Everything has its place, everything has its ruler, everything fits into a divine bureaucracy as organized as the city administration. But here's what makes the Mesopotamian system unique. Unlike the Egyptian pharaoh who claims to be a god himself, Mesopotamian kings are merely human servants of the divine. The true rulers are the gods, and the gods govern through institutions, temples staffed by priests, councils that deliberate, assemblies that vote. When we read texts like the Atrahasis epic or the Enuma Elish creation story, we find gods arguing in council chambers, forming alliances, striking deals, even staging labor revolts. The divine world mirrors the human world because, in Mesopotamian thought, human civilization is literally modeled on divine civilization. The city of Nippur occupies a unique position in this system. It belongs to Enlil, and it never becomes a political capital. Kings might rule from Ur or Babylon or Akkad, but they must come to Nippur to receive legitimacy. Why? Because Enlil possesses the tablets of destiny, the cosmic documents that determine fate itself. control the tablets of destiny, and you control reality. Lose them, and chaos erupts. The tablets appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian myths as the ultimate source of authority. Whoever holds them makes the rules. This brings us to a crucial point. The Divine Triad isn't just three powerful gods, it's a system of checks and balances. Anu is the nominal supreme deity, but he's distant, rarely intervening in earthly affairs. Enlil is the executive authority, the god who actually runs things day to day. And Enki is the clever administrator who implements policy, solves problems, and occasionally subverts Enlil's decisions when he disagrees with them. Sound familiar? It should. This is the world's first documented separation of powers: legislative, executive, and judicial authority distributed among different offices. And when the system breaks down, when the gods can't agree on what to do about noisy, overpopulated humanity, the result is catastrophe on a cosmic scale. The technical challenge facing the Divine Triad is one that every government has faced since civilization began. How do you manage a population that has grown too large, too loud, too demanding? The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BCE but preserving much older traditions, lays out the problem with startling clarity. Humanity was created as a workforce. The younger gods, exhausted from digging irrigation canals and maintaining the rivers, stage a labor strike. They march on Enlil's temple, weapons in hand, demanding relief. The Divine Council convenes, and Enki proposes a solution. Create a new species, humans, to do the work instead. Mix clay with the blood of a slain god, and you get beings with just enough divine spark to be useful workers, but not enough to threaten divine authority. It's a perfect plan. For a while. The problem is that humans are too successful. They multiply, they build cities, and cities are loud. The cuneiform texts are explicit about this. The noise, the hubbub, the tumult of human civilization disturbs Enlil's sleep. We might dismiss this as anthropomorphic fancy, but think about what it represents. 1,200 years of warfare, trade, construction, ritual, population growth concentrated in urban centers that have never existed before. Humanity has fundamentally changed the world, and the change is irreversible. Enlil, the god of order and authority, responds as authorities have always responded to populations they can't control. First, he sends plague. The texts describe disease sweeping through the cities, reducing populations. But Enki, who has affection for his creations, teaches humanity the rituals and offerings to propitiate the gods, and the plague recedes. Humanity rebounds. Next, Enlil tries drought. For 3 years, then 6 years, the rains fail, the rivers dwindle, famine spreads. Parents are driven to eating their own children. The texts don't shy from this horror. But again, Enki intervenes. He sends fish up the rivers, creatures from his domain of fresh water, and humanity survives. Enlil's frustration builds. This is no longer about noise. This is about control, about authority, about a creation that has exceeded its purpose. And so he proposes the ultimate solution, a flood. Not a normal seasonal inundation, but a deluge that will wipe the earth clean, a reset button on the entire human experiment. Here's where the technical challenge becomes clear. Enlil must coordinate all the forces of heaven and earth. The 7 judges of the underworld must lift their torches, igniting cosmic fire. The weather gods must gather every storm. The god Adad must ride at the front. The warrior gods Shulet and Hanish must shatter the landscape. But most critically, Enki must cooperate. Because Enki controls the waters beneath the earth, the Abzu, and without releasing those waters, no flood can be complete. The scale of this undertaking is staggering. We're not talking about a local inundation, the kind that occurred regularly in Mesopotamia. We're talking about coordinated divine action to breach the boundary between the cosmic waters above the heavens and the cosmic waters below the earth, drowning the middle realm where humanity lives. It requires the dissolution of the fundamental structure of creation itself. The technical specifications preserved in the text are surprisingly precise. The flood will last 7 days and 7 nights. The water will cover the mountains. No human construction can withstand it. But here's the engineering problem. How do you actually build something that survives when the entire cosmos is being dismantled? Enki faces an impossible dilemma. He has sworn an oath to Enlil. The gods have decided in council, and their decision is final. To break his oath would be to violate the cosmic order as fundamentally as the flood itself. But Enki has grown attached to humanity, these clever creatures who worship him, who build his temples, who channel water as he channels water, who create as he creates. So Enki does what clever gods do. He finds a loophole. He cannot speak directly to the human Atrahasis, the extremely wise man who serves as his priest. That would violate his oath. But he can speak to the wall of Atrahasis's reed house. And if Atrahasis happens to overhear a god giving instructions to a wall, well, that's not Enki's fault, is it? The instructions are specific. Build a boat. Make it round like the Kufa boats that still float on the Euphrates today, circular vessels of reeds and bitumen. Root it over completely so water cannot enter. Make it equal in length and width. The text specifies 120 cubits each, roughly 180 feet, forming a perfect square. Seal every crack. With bitumen, bring aboard your family, craftsmen to preserve human knowledge and animals of every kind. Think about what this requires. You're a Bronze Age farmer. The largest boat you've ever seen is perhaps 30 feet long, used for river transport. You're being asked to construct a vessel 30 times that size, waterproof enough to survive the dissolution of the cosmos, large enough to house what amounts to a seed bank of civilization. You have no modern materials, no steel, no power tools, just reeds, wood, rope, and bitumen. And you have to do it secretly, because if Enlil discovers the plan, if any god realizes that Enki is subverting the divine council's decree, the consequences would be catastrophic. The text preserves Atrahasis's question to the god, the wall, rather. What shall I say to the city, to the people watching? Because you can't build a 180-foot boat in secret. Your neighbors will ask questions. The city assembly will want to know what you're doing with all those resources. Enki's response is darkly ironic. Tell them you've offended Enlil, that you must leave his domain. Tell them you're going to live in the Abzu with Enki instead. And because they worship Enlil, they'll rejoice at your departure. They'll help you build your boat, thinking they're getting rid of a troublemaker. Tell them that Enki will rain down abundance upon them, bread in the morning, wheat at night. He's not lying. There will be rain. So much rain, just not the kind they're hoping for. Atrahasis, whose name would later become Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and whose story would echo in the tale of Noah thousands of years later, becomes the human face of this cosmic drama. The texts give us glimpses of his character. He's described as extremely wise, a devout worshipper of Enki, someone who understands the sacred rituals and speaks with the gods regularly. He's not a king or a warrior. He's essentially a priest administrator, exactly the kind of person who keeps Bronze Age civilization running. Imagine being in Atrahasis's position. You've just received instructions from your god to build something unprecedented because all the other gods have decided to destroy every human being on Earth, including you, your family, everyone you've ever known. You have perhaps weeks or months to complete this task. You must convince your community to help you without revealing the true purpose of your construction. And you must maintain faith that your plan will actually work when the entire divine council of the universe has decided otherwise. The texts preserve Atrahasis's actions with careful detail. He gathers craftsmen, not random laborers but specialists, shipwrights who understand hull construction, reed workers who know how to weave watertight walls, rope makers, bitumen workers who can seal every joint. These aren't just passengers being saved, they're the human knowledge base being preserved. A civilization isn't just people, it's skills, techniques, accumulated wisdom. He brings livestock, but not just for food. These are breeding pairs, the genetic foundation for rebuilding herds. The text specifies fat and lean animals, suggesting selection for diversity. He brings wild animals too, though the text is frustratingly vague about how exactly you get wild animals onto a boat. But the principle is clear: preserve biological diversity, and he brings his family. The text mentions his wife, his sons and their wives, his extended household. These are the people who must restart civilization after the waters recede. They must remember not just how to farm and build, but why. What rituals maintain cosmic order, what offerings please the gods, what laws govern human interaction. The psychological weight of this knowledge must have been crushing. Atrahasis knows that everyone he passes in the street, everyone who helps him build his boat with cheerful incomprehension, will be dead in days. The children playing in the canals, the vendors in the marketplace, the priests in the other temples, all of them doomed. The text gives us one moment of profound humanity. As Atrahasis boards the boat, as he seals the door from inside, he weeps. "My heart was broken," the text says. He can hear the city outside, normal life continuing, people who have no idea what's coming. Then the first drops of rain begin to fall. The solution Enki devised, a floating vessel that preserves a seed of humanity and knowledge while the flood destroys everything else, represents a sophisticated understanding of crisis management. But its execution reveals something deeper about Mesopotamian thought. Enki doesn't save humanity by opposing Enlil directly. He doesn't stage a coup or lead a divine rebellion. Instead, he works within the system, using ambiguity and technical compliance to achieve his goal. He keeps the letter of his oath while violating its spirit. This is lawyer God thinking, bureaucrat God thinking, the kind of clever workaround that appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. When the flood begins, it begins with terrifying speed. The text describes Adad, the storm god, riding at the front, his thunder shaking the foundations of the earth. The warrior gods Shulat and Hanish go before him, destroying mountains. The Anunnaki, the judges of the underworld, lift their torches, and their light sets the land ablaze. Then darkness falls, a darkness so complete it turns day to night. The flood arrives not as rising water, but as total chaos. Rain hammers down from above. The cosmic waters beyond the firmament break through. But crucially, Enki opens the Abzu, and water erupts from below, from springs, from wells, from the rivers themselves flowing backward. The careful structure of the cosmos, with its neat division between upper waters and lower waters, and dry land in between, collapses. For 7 days and 7 nights it continues. The text describes people clinging to roofs as their houses dissolve, bodies floating in the floodwaters like dragonflies. The noise that started all this is drowned out by the roar of wind and water, and the gods, having unleashed this catastrophe, are horrified by what they've done. This is where the Mesopotamian text differs profoundly from later flood narratives. The gods aren't distant, unconcerned observers. They're terrified. They retreat to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs. The mother goddess Nintu, she who helped create humanity, weeps at what she's witnessing. Her lips are covered with fever heat. She watches her children, her creations, dying by the millions, and she cries out in anguish. "How could I agree to this?" she laments. "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering catastrophe to destroy my people?" Even Enlil seems shaken by the magnitude of destruction. The text suggests that the gods didn't fully comprehend what they were deciding. It's one thing to vote for population reduction in a council chamber. It's another to watch the actual obliteration of civilization. But they've also created another problem. Who will feed them? The gods depend on humanity for sustenance, not physical food, but the regular sacrifices and offerings that maintain cosmic order. Without humans to perform rituals, to maintain temples, to speak their names, what happens to the gods? Do they simply fade away, starving in their heavenly realm? When the flood finally recedes and Atrahasis' boat runs aground on a mountain, Atrahasis' first action is telling. He doesn't check on his family or survey the damage. He builds an altar and makes an offering, reed and cedar and myrtle, a sacrifice of precious aromatic woods. The smell rises to the heavens, and the gods, who haven't smelled sacrifice in 7 days, gather like flies around the offering. The image is deliberately undignified. These mighty cosmic powers, reduced to desperate hunger, swarming around the smoke of Atrahasis' fire. Enlil arrives and is furious. How did a human survive? No one was supposed to escape. He immediately suspects Enki. the only god who would be both smart enough and sentimental enough to save someone. What follows is one of the most remarkable divine council scenes in ancient literature. Enki doesn't deny what he did, but he doesn't apologize either. Instead, he goes on the offensive. He points out the injustice of Enlil's solution. Yes, humanity was noisy and troublesome. Yes, they needed to be controlled. But genocide? Collective punishment of the innocent along with the guilty. What kind of justice is that? Impose the penalty on whoever commits the wrong, Enki argues. Impose the punishment on whoever transgresses, but don't destroy everyone for the crimes of some. He then proposes alternative population control measures, natural predators, lions, wolves, hyenas, to keep human numbers in check, disease and famine, but in measured doses, not apocalyptic plagues. Most radically, he suggests making some women infertile, creating a class of priestesses whose role is religious service rather than reproduction. Population control through social engineering rather than mass death. It's a stunning moment. A god arguing for proportional justice, for system design rather than brute force, for working with human nature rather than against it. And Enlil, perhaps chastened by seeing the consequences of his decision, perhaps simply exhausted, agrees. But there's a cost. Atrahasis and his wife are granted immortality, removed from humanity, transformed into something other. They cannot return to restart civilization among mortals. They become living proof of the flood, eternal witnesses dwelling at the edge of the world where the waters meet the sky. The survivors left on the boat, Atrahasis' family, and the craftsmen will repopulate the earth. But humanity enters its second age knowing something it didn't know before. The gods are not all wise. They make mistakes. They can be cruel, but also merciful. They can disagree with each other, and in those disagreements, there's room for human agency. The wider significance of the Divine Triad and their greatest story, the flood narrative, ripples forward through history in ways the ancient Mesopotamians could never have imagined. When Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldees, he carries Mesopotamian stories with him. When the Israelites encounter Babylonian culture during the exile, they adapt and transform Mesopotamian traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered on tablets in the library of Ashurbanipal, contains a flood story nearly identical to Atrahasis's, and scholars immediately recognized its connection to Genesis. But the influence goes far deeper than literary borrowing. The very concept of the Divine Triad, three supreme authorities dividing cosmic responsibilities, establishes a template for organized religion that persists for millennia. Christianity's Trinity, while theologically distinct, carries echoes of this tripartite division of divine power. Hindu Trimurti, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer, mirrors the functional specialization of Anu, Enlil, and Enki. More fundamentally, the Mesopotamian divine council model shapes how we think about legitimate authority. The idea that power should be distributed, that different offices should have different responsibilities, that decisions should be debated and justified, these aren't Greek inventions. They emerge first in Sumer, in the temple councils of Nippur, in the divine assemblies described in myths 4,000 years old. Archaeological evidence reveals how thoroughly the Divine Triad shaped ancient Near Eastern civilization. At Nippur, the Ikur temple complex of Enlil dominated the city from 3000 BCE until Parthian times, a span of 3,000 years. Kings from Sargon of Akkad to Hammurabi of Babylon to Nebuchadnezzar II of Neo-Babylon all left inscriptions recording their dedications to Enlil, their renovations of his temple, their claims to rule by his authority. At Eridu, the sanctuary of Enki, called the House of the Aquifer, stood above a subterranean stream, physical evidence of the Abzu that Enki controlled. Priests conducted rituals over this water source, rituals connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld through the medium of sacred water. When you stand in the ruins of Eridu today, you can still see the water channels, still understand how the temple architecture embodied cosmological belief. The law codes that emerge from Mesopotamia, Ur-Nammu, Lipit, Ishtar, Hammurabi, all claim divine sanction from the Triad. Hammurabi's famous stele shows him receiving laws from the sun god Shamash, but the prologue invokes Anu and Enlil as the ultimate authorities who granted him kingship. The laws themselves reflect principles articulated in the flood story: proportional justice, punishment fitting the crime, protection for the weak against the powerful. Economic tablets from temple archives reveal a bureaucracy of staggering complexity. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur managed agricultural land, distributed rations to workers, regulated trade, and kept records that would be the envy of modern corporations. This isn't primitive religion. This is sophisticated institutional management, running an economy that supported thousands of people across multiple cities. The astronomical observations compiled by Mesopotamian priests, tracking the movements of planets and stars to read divine will, laid the foundation for scientific astronomy. The division of the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. These are Mesopotamian mathematical concepts developed for calculating divine time, the movements of heavenly bodies through Anu's realm. But perhaps the most profound legacy is literature itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation story, the Descent of Inanna, the Atrahasis epic. These are the world's oldest complex narratives. They established literary techniques we still use: foreshadowing, metaphor, tragic irony, the hero's journey, the clever trickster, the wrathful authority, the wise counselor. When we tell stories today, we're using patterns first established in Mesopotamian myths about the Divine Triad. Modern comparative mythology reveals something else. The flood story appears in cultures worldwide: India, China, Mesoamerica, Australia. For generations, scholars debated whether these represented distant memories of real floods or independent mythological inventions. Now we understand something more nuanced. The Mesopotamian version is the oldest written account, dated to around 1800 BCE. It likely inspired versions in neighboring cultures: Hebrew, Hurrian, Hittite. But the deeper pattern it represents, divine council debates, humanity's flawed creation, catastrophic reset, merciful preservation. This pattern appears because it addresses universal human concerns about our relationship to power, to nature, to the forces that control our lives. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, when the 2004 tsunami struck Southeast Asia, when floods submerged Bangladesh or Pakistan, we see how ancient the trauma of water destruction is. Mesopotamian flood myths resonate because they speak to a terror embedded in human consciousness wherever civilizations arise near rivers, coasts, or floodplains. The Divine Triad story is our story. How do we survive when nature and power combine to destroy us? How do we rebuild when everything is lost? The archaeological work at sites like Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk continues today, revealing new insights with each season. Climate data extracted from sediment cores shows that ancient Mesopotamia experienced severe droughts and floods, cycles of climate change that directly threatened civilization. The myths aren't fantastic inventions, they're culturally encoded memories of real environmental crises, processed through religious belief. Recent translations of previously unread tablets add details to our understanding. We now know that different city-states emphasize different gods of the triad. Nippur belonged to Enlil, Eridu to Enki, while Anu's cult center was at Uruk. This wasn't just theology, it was politics. Supporting one god over another could mean aligning with one city's political faction against another's. Religion and power were inseparable. DNA studies of modern populations in Iraq, Iran, and the broader Middle East show genetic continuity with ancient Mesopotamians. The people who wrote these tablets, who worshipped these gods, who built these temples, their descendants still live in the region. The Divine Triad isn't some exotic ancient oddity. It's part of the living heritage of millions of people whose ancestors created the first civilization. And we still haven't translated all those tablets. 30,000 at Nippur alone, with thousands more at other sites, many still unpublished, sitting in museum storage rooms around the world. Each one potentially contains new information about how the Divine Triad was worshipped, how their myths developed, how their authority shaped daily life. The story is far from complete. What does it mean that humanity's oldest gods are not perfect, all-knowing beings, but flawed personalities who make mistakes, who argue, who change their minds? The Divine Triad challenges our assumptions about ancient religion and, by extension, about how ancient peoples thought. These Bronze Age Mesopotamians weren't naive. They didn't worship their gods out of simple fear or ignorance. The texts reveal a sophisticated understanding that the gods represent cosmic principles, order and chaos, wisdom and force, authority and compassion, and that these principles exist in tension. No single principle can rule absolutely. Even Enlil, with all his power and the tablets of destiny, cannot act without considering the other gods. Even Anu, the supreme deity, rules by consent of the divine assembly. This represents a profound philosophical insight. Absolute power is dangerous. Unchecked authority leads to catastrophe. The flood happens because Enlil acts without adequate consideration of alternatives, without listening to dissenting voices, namely Enki's. The resolution happens because the gods establish checks on power, create mechanisms for population control that don't require genocide. Compare this to the biblical flood story. In Genesis, God acts alone, judges alone, saves whom he chooses. The decision is presented as righteous, necessary, and unambiguous. But in the Mesopotamian version, ambiguity pervades everything. Was Enlil wrong? The text suggests yes, but doesn't say so explicitly. Was Enki right to save Atrahasis? He violated divine decree, but everyone, even Enlil, seems relieved someone survived. The text doesn't provide moral certainty, it provides complexity. This complexity reflects something important about Mesopotamian civilization. These people lived in cities that required cooperation on a massive scale, coordinated irrigation, organized defense, managed trade. They couldn't afford simplistic thinking. Their myths encode hard-won wisdom about managing complex systems, about the dangers of unchecked power, about the necessity of diverse perspectives. The relationship between the Divine Triad and humanity also reveals a striking reciprocity. Humans need gods for cosmic order, for reign and fertility, for legitimacy and law. But gods need humans for worship, for sacrifice, for the labor that maintains temples and performs rituals. Neither side can exist without the other. This isn't the distant, self-sufficient God of later monotheism. These are gods embedded in a mutual relationship with their creation. What lessons does this offer us today? Consider how we think about authority. We've inherited the Mesopotamian insight that power should be distributed, that checks and balances matter, that different functions require different leadership. The American constitutional system, with its separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers, echoes the Divine Triad's functional specialization. We learned this principle from Mesopotamia, though we may have forgotten the source. Consider how we think about environmental crisis. The flood story is fundamentally about ecological collapse triggered by overpopulation and resource strain. The god's solution, limiting population growth, introducing natural predators, creating sustainable management systems, reflects sophisticated thinking about carrying capacity and environmental balance. We face similar challenges today with climate change, habitat destruction, and unsustainable growth. Consider how we think about knowledge preservation. Atrahasis' boat isn't just a survival vessel. It's a seed vault, a library, a craft guild, and a genetic bank combined. When we build modern equivalents, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, digital archives of human knowledge, species preservation programs, we're following a pattern established in Bronze Age myth. We understand that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost, that deliberate preservation requires planning and sacrifice. The Divine Triad also teaches us something about cultural continuity. For 3,000 years, these gods shaped civilization in the ancient Near East. Kings rose and fell, empires replaced empires, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, but Anu, Enlil, and Enki remained. The myths evolved, the emphasis shifted, new gods entered the pantheon, but the triad endured. This represents something beyond mere religious conservatism. It represents the staying power of stories that address fundamental human questions about power, wisdom, and our place in the cosmos. But here's the paradox. These mighty gods who once commanded the worship of millions, whose temples dominated city skylines, whose names were invoked in every legal document and royal inscription, they're almost forgotten now. If you stop random people on the street and ask about Anu, Enlil, and Enki, how many would recognize the names? Yet ask about Noah's flood, and everyone knows the story. The gods are forgotten, but their myths survive, transformed and adapted, living on in new forms. This tells us something profound about how human culture works. Ideas persist across millennia, but their containers change. The specific gods may fade, but the patterns they represent, authority and wisdom, force and compassion, justice and mercy, remain essential to how we understand the world. Subscribe for more videos.